Hi everyone, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm really happy you're here. Tonight, we're going to go on a calm and quiet trip to learn something amazing. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and let's enjoy this peaceful science story together. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? If you like relaxing science videos, don't forget to tap the like button. Now let's begin. Imagine the world as one slow, sleeping animal, its skin a single stretch of land curled around a warm blue heart. Long before our map split into pieces and our seas learned all the names between them, the ground we walk on was once gathered close, shoulder to shoulder, like friends huddled near a fire. People later would call that whole embrace Pangea. Say it softly and it sounds like a lullaby. Pan for all, Gaia for Earth, the All-Earth. Not a moment that snapped into place, not a quick trick by nature, but a long drift, a careful slide, a patient tug over millions of years. If you listen with the kind of ear that waits, you can almost hear it. The gentle scrape of stone against stone, the deep hum of a planet that never truly stops moving. Beneath our feet, the rock is not one lonely slab. It is a set of rafts, large and thick, that float on rock that is hot and soft like taffy if you wait long enough and look with the right eyes. These rafts, the continents, ride on slow rivers of warmth inside the earth, currents that rise and sink like breath. Over time, those rafts can travel. They bump, they turn, they meet, they part, and sometimes, in the great ages when patience is the only clock, they all come together and hold hands. That is what Pangea was, a family reunion of land. To imagine it, let your mind become a bird that does not tire. Fly high above the globe, so high that clouds look like brushstrokes and the ocean is a calm blue sheet. Down there, where we now see the long curl of South America and the wide shoulder of Africa, imagine those shapes pressed together like puzzle pieces that never truly forgot each other. Where North America stands today, picture it turned and drawn close to the northwest side of Africa and Europe, their edges lined up by old mountain belts like stitches on a healed scar. Where India is now racing north into Asia, picture it still tucked along the southern rim of this one vast land. Australia too, and Antarctica, not lonely at the bottom of the map but resting nearby like quiet cousins at the same table. When all the lands met, a single shoreline traced the edge of the world. Waves folded and unfolded against one rim. Inside, far from that rim, the wind carried dust across a giant interior, and rain sometimes had to work very hard to reach the middle. There were big deserts under that sky because air that drops down and warms dries out the clouds, and on a land this wide the air could grow tired of giving water. Yet in other seasons there were strong monsoons, because a body this large warms and cools in a way that tugs the winds back and forth, pulling in wet air and sending it out again like a slow tide in the sky. It is easy to think of rock as lifeless and still, but even rock keeps a kind of memory. When lava rises at the bottom of the sea and cools into new crust, tiny grains inside it turn like little compass needles and freeze in place, pointing to where the pole was at that time. This is how we can tell the continents have moved. The iron bits point one way in older rocks, and another way in younger ones, like pages in a diary. There are other memories too. On the coasts that are now far apart, you can find the same fossils. Leaf prints of a plant called Glossopteris, bones of ancient reptiles that could not have swum an ocean, marks from ice sheets that once scraped across stone in matching directions. These are quiet witnesses. They do not shout. They only wait to be read, and when we read them, they tell us that the lands were joined. If you hold a map and trace with your finger along the bulge of Brazil and the inward curve of West Africa, you can feel the fit yourself. It is not perfect because waves chew edges and rivers rearrange shorelines, but it is near enough that the idea settles in your chest like a truth you somehow always knew. These pieces belong together. Now think of the inside of Earth, where heat rises the way warm water rises in a pot. That heat moves the mantle very slowly, so slowly that a person cannot see it in a lifetime, or 1,000 lifetimes, but over deep time it adds up. Where hot rock lifts up, it spreads the seafloor like a seam opening in a jacket, and where cooler rock sinks down, it pulls old crust under in long, deep trenches. The continents, thick and stubborn, ride along when the pattern of rising and sinking lines up just so. The continents drift toward one another. Mountains bloom where they crash together, as if the ground has wrinkled its brow. Later, when the pattern changes, the same forces may pull them apart. This cycle of closing and opening is like the Earth's slow heartbeat. Geologists sometimes call it the supercontinent cycle, and one version of it, the closing of an old ocean and the opening of a new one, is known as the Wilson cycle, named after a scientist who listened to the rocks and heard the rhythm they were tapping out. On Pangaea, life felt the shape of the land, the way wind feels the shape of a hill. Animals walked long routes across dry interiors, where seasons swung between hot and chill. Giant ferns and early conifers made green bands along rivers that wound like silk threads through the sand. In some places, coal swamps held still water, and the air above them was thick with the soft sounds of insects. Later, as time moved into the age of reptiles, there were early dinosaurs and many other creatures, some with long limbs for running across open flats, some with sturdy bodies for pushing through brush, some with jaw shapes fitted to new plants the way a key fits an old lock. The connection of all lands did something important for life. It opened paths. A lizard born on what is now Africa could, in principle, walk its line of generations into lands we would later call Europe and North America without ever crossing a salt body. Plants spread their seeds with wind and water along the one great rim of shore, and river system braided through the middle like veins. Stand for a moment at the imagined centre of Pangaea. The sea is far away in every direction. The sky is a wide bowl. When the wind picks up dust, it can carry it for weeks before a mountain range stops it. On some afternoons, the air grows so clear you can see a day's walk ahead. On others, it shimmers with heat, and the distance trembles as if the world is breathing. When storms come, they come as if an old door has opened, and rain that has waited a long time pours through. The rich smell of wet ground rises like bread in an oven. Rivers swell, then settle, then leave behind new silt in which seeds find a home. The ground is not empty. It holds burrows and roots and the hidden work of tiny lives. Beetles turn leaves into soil. Fungi find their quiet bargains with roots. Life learns the pattern of a land that is linked edge to edge, and it hums to that pattern in patient repeating songs. Along the outer rim, the song is different. The coast of a supercontinent is one long chance for life to meet the sea. Here the land lifts and drops as Earth's slow breath moves the level of water. Tide pools collect stories in bowls of stone. Fish hunt in the mouths of the rivers, where fresh and salt water braid into brackish threads. The wind brings salt, and birds, where there are birds, leave tracks like tiny arrows in wet sand. Waves do their old work the same as always. They carry grains away, stack them somewhere else, carve cliffs, lay down beaches, and build bars and spits that drift like slow thoughts. Even when the shapes of the continents gather and then separate, this edge life remains. It is an old lesson the planet teaches over and over. The border between things is a place of making. Pangaea did not rise from nothing. Before it there were other gatherings, earlier supercontinents with names that sound like myths, Rodinia, older still, and even others before. Each one had its own long life and then gave way. When continents meet, the squeeze raises mountain belts that can stretch for 1,000 miles. Those mountains wear down under rain and frost, grain by grain, and the grains wash into seas that form when the land later opens again. The story of rock is a swapping of places. What was once a mountain can become sand on a beach. What was once sand can, buried and pressed, becomes stone. What was once stone can be remelted and sent up as new crust in a different ocean. The Earth is very good at reusing itself. How do we know the shape of a world that lived so long ago? We read rocks like pages that never rot. We match the age of crystals in different places and see that they were born in the same fire. We trace belts of deformed, folded stone across coasts that are now oceans apart, and they line up like torn cloth that you can set back together along the tear. We follow the trail of fossils that show where climates once were mild or cold. We measure how ancient lava pointed to the poles when it cooled. Even the scars of glaciers remain on the bedrock, long scratches that tell which way the ice moved, on lands that now sit far from any polar cold. When you add all these hints up and let them rest in your mind, a picture comes into focus, a time when all lands were one. In that time, the climate was not the same everywhere. The inside of Pangaea had extremes: hot summers, cold winters, long dry spells broken by strong wet seasons. Closer to the sea, the air was softer, and fog would thread through mornings. Where mountains stood, rain fell on the windward side and dry land stretched on the lee. Because mountains teach clouds where to let go, forests found the places that suited them, spreading where water and warmth match their needs. Life is patient and tries many rooms until it finds the ones that fit. Some creatures learn to keep water inside better and could range farther from rivers. Some learn to sleep through heat or cold. Seeds grew wings or hooks or shells to travel and wait. Step by step, life tuned itself to the new grand shape of the ground. But even while Pangaea was whole, the forces that would loosen its grip were already at work. Deep below, heat gathered in places where the crust was thick and old. In some regions, plumes of hotter rock rose like slow wide candles. When hot rock rises, it can thin and stretch what lies above. Cracks appear, valleys sink, lakes form in long lines. If the stretching continues, those valleys can widen into new oceans. This is how a supercontinent falls apart. Not by a sudden tear, but by a long sigh that opens a seam. On the surface, it begins with small steps. A few volcanoes, a chain of lakes, a spreading set of faults where the ground slips a little at a time. Over millions of years, those small steps become a new seafloor, and water rolls in to find its level. One shoreline becomes two. The family circle opens. For now, let the story rest in the time when all lands held hands. Picture the sun rising over a single coast so long that dawn cannot touch it all at once, and the same sun setting over a desert far inland where the light turns the dust gold and then red and then purple as the first stars appear. Picture rivers that do not know yet that one day their mouths will face a different ocean when the land shifts under them. Picture mountains being born as far-off plates press together, the birth hidden deep and slow, the first lifts not yet tall enough to wear snow. Somewhere a small animal steps from shade to light and leaves a track that will vanish by noon, and yet the kind of foot that made it will walk the world for ages. The ground is quiet but not still. The silence is full of motion. If you sit with it, you can feel the earth telling its long, patient tale in pulses that are too wide for one life to hold, but gentle enough for any heart to hear. And hold also this softer truth. The map in your head is a moment, not a rule. There was a time before the current shapes, and there will be a time after. Today we name continents as if they were final. Africa, Asia, the Americas, Europe, Antarctica, Australia. We draw thick lines of blue between them, but the lines are not commands, they are pauses. The same deep breath that pulled land together into Pangaea will one day, in another age, draw lands together again in a new design. The planet is a patient artist who uses stone for clay and time for water, smoothing and reshaping, pressing and lifting, gathering and letting go. Pangaea was one of its great works, signed not with ink, but with mountain chains and fossil trails and the matching curves of far coasts. To imagine that whole is to feel how wide the Earth's story is, and how soft its voice can be when it speaks through wind and waves and the slow rub of plates below. For sleep and peace, it is enough to know that even rock is part of a lullaby, and that the ground under us is not a floor but a very slow river that carries us through ages we can only touch in our minds, a river that once flowed all lands together and will, in time, change its path again. Now imagine drifting forward in time, not as a sudden leap, but as a slow walk along the quiet corridors of millions of years. Pangaea still lies across the middle of the world like a giant sleeping form, but under its surface the unseen warmth of the earth stirs in deep, slow spirals. The mantle beneath is restless in its patience, carrying heat from the planet's inner heart toward the crust, like the breath of a sleeper turning in bed. Where these rising plumes of warmth push against the underside of the land, the crust swells ever so slightly. It is no more than a subtle lift, a swelling so slow that it would take thousands of generations for any change to be noticed, but the earth keeps pressing. Cracks begin to open in the interior of Pangaea, hairline faults that stretch across vast plains and quiet forests. To life above, they are valleys forming, lakes appearing, hills sinking. To the planet, they are the first hints of release, the first whispered signals that the great embrace of land will not last forever. If you walked across one of these early rift valleys in that ancient time, you might not think of it as the seam of a future ocean. You would see rivers meandering in the low ground, their banks thick with early conifers, cicades and ferns. You would hear the calls of reptiles that sunned themselves on rocky outcrops and the quiet rustle of wind moving through leaves. But beneath, molten rock from the mantle is creeping upward, spreading into the spaces between faulting blocks, cooling into basalt. Each new pulse of this molten rock pushes the land ever so slightly farther apart. These valleys deepen, the flanking highlands rise, and eventually, as they widen and sink, they welcome in the first long fingers of seawater. What was once a continuous stretch of land becomes two coasts, facing one another across a strip of new ocean. Scientists studying the rock record can see these steps as clearly as footprints in wet sand. The basalt left behind in ancient rift zones tells of lava flows that cooled in the open air, later overlain by sediments washed in from surrounding highlands. Fossils shift too. Species that were once shared across the land appear in fewer and fewer places, their ranges cut off by widening waters. In Pangaea's heart, some life adapts to the changing terrain. Others vanish into the deep shadow of extinction, unable to find a place in the reshaped world. Change, as always, is both a sculptor and a thief. The rifting that would eventually split Pangaea began in several places at once, a slow dance of separation across different regions. One major seam began where the present-day Central Atlantic lies, between the future shapes of North America and Africa. Here, vast outpourings of lava marked the opening of the ocean, a geological event we now call the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. These eruptions spread thick layers of basalt over thousands of square kilometers, the cooled rock now hidden under younger sediments but still whispering its history to those who know where to listen. The gases released in such eruptions, carbon dioxide among them, shifted the climate, warming the air and waters, unsettling the balance that life had come to know. Some species perished, others spread into the gaps, finding new corridors where land and sea began to mingle. Farther south, the land that would become South America and Africa began its own gentle parting from the great mass of Gondwana, the southern portion of Pangaea. The eastern coast of what is now South America slowly peeled away from the bulge of West Africa. As they drifted apart, currents began to form between them, weaving a new tapestry of marine life into the narrow seaway that grew into the South Atlantic. To the east, Antarctica and Australia clung together a while longer, like two friends reluctant to part, while India prepared for a journey that would one day carry it north at remarkable speed toward a collision with Asia, raising the Himalayas. In their long, drawn-out unravelling, mountains also played their part. The ranges raised by Pangaea's assembly, towering belts formed when continents collided, began to wear down under the patient work of rain, ice and wind. Grain by grain their slopes crumbled, feeding rivers with sediment. Those rivers wandered across the widening rifts, building deltas, filling valleys and laying down the layers that would, in another age, harden into sandstone, shale and limestone. In these layers, the future would find the imprints of leaves, shells and the footprints, all quietly recording the lives that crossed this changing stage. The climates of Pangaea shifted with its breaking. As the land masses pulled apart, coastlines lengthened, and more of the planet's surface lay under the influence of the sea. This brought softer, more moderate climates to regions that had once been harsh interiors. Moist air travelled farther inland, feeding new forests and grasslands. Rain patterns shifted, places that had been deserts bloomed for a time, while others dried under new wind patterns. The oceans themselves, in their newborn basins, began to circulate in fresh ways, carrying heat from equator to poles and reshaping the conditions for life everywhere. Life adapted as it always had, exploring the new opportunities born from change. In the seas, marine reptiles found new hunting grounds. Corals and shellfish spread into warm, shallow waters along the freshly formed coasts. On land, dinosaurs of every size roamed through forests and plains, their ranges expanding and contracting with the moving continents. Insects diversified alongside flowering plants, beginning a partnership that would colour the world with blossoms in ages to come. The spread of life mirrored the spread of the continents, a constant drift into new spaces, a ceaseless search for niches where survival could take root. What makes the story of Pangaea's fall so compelling is that it was never truly an ending, only a transformation. The supercontinent was both the peak of a long gathering and the starting point for a scattering that would shape the Earth as we know it. The very same forces that brought all lands together were the ones that pulled them apart. Mantle convection, plate movement, the steady recycling of crust. The surface we walk on is not a fixed stage, but a moving mosaic, its pieces endlessly rearranged over spans of time so vast that they slip beyond ordinary human sense. If you could watch the process from far above, with the patience to see millions of years as minutes, you would witness a mesmerizing flow. Continents would glide across the globe, touch, merge, swell into mountains, then drift away again, leaving behind arcs of islands, crescents of sea, and coastlines like torn fabric edges. The ocean basins would open and close, and their floors would rise and sink like tides far too slow for any tide table. In this view there is no permanence, only patterns repeating with endless variation. The breaking of Pangaea also set the stage for future supercontinents. Geologists believe that Earth's surface follows a cycle of assembly and dispersal, with supercontinents forming roughly every 400 to 600 million years. Before Pangaea, there was Rodinia. Before Rodinia, there was Nuna. And in the far future, the drifting continents may gather again into a landmass scientists call a Masia, or Pangaea Proxima. Each cycle rewrites the map of Earth, reshapes climates, and rearranges the habitats in which life must find its way. And so, the rise and fall of supercontinents is not a tale with a beginning and an end, but a repeating chapter in the deeper story of our planet. For the creatures and plants living on Pangaea as it fractured, these grand patterns were invisible. Their lives unfolded on the scale of days, seasons, and years. They knew the warmth of a summer sun, the scarcity of a dry season, the shelter of a grove, the danger of a predator's shadow. They followed the rhythms of their own lifespans, unaware that the ground beneath them was gliding, changing the stage for all future life. And perhaps that is the truest image of Earth's slow transformations. The great rearrangements happen beneath the feet of lives that continue in the moment, each step taken without knowing the journey of the land itself. If you stood now at the edge of one of Pangaea's growing rifts in those times, you might see cliffs of dark volcanic rock rising above a valley where rivers snake through green floodplains. You might hear the low thunder of distant eruptions, smell the tang of minerals in warm springs, feel the ground tremble faintly under the deep pulse of magma moving below. Overhead, pterosaurs might wheel on wide wings, riding thermals rising from sun-warmed stone. The air would be thick with the scent of resin from conifers, and somewhere nearby the splash of an ancient amphibian would mark the meeting of water and life. This was not a world ending, it was a world becoming something else. Through all this, the Earth kept its slow, patient tempo. The supercontinent's great body relaxed its grip, each separation a note in a long, low song of motion and change. And as the pieces drifted farther apart, the seeds of new worlds were sown, not just in the physical sense of new continents and oceans, but in the possibilities for life to evolve in different corners, to try new shapes and strategies, to meet the challenges of new climates and new neighbours. The fall of Pangaea was, in truth, a widening of the stage on which the drama of life could unfold. As the centuries of stone stretched onward into millions of years, the divisions that began as narrow rifts widened into the deep blue breadths of oceans. Where once the supercontinent Pangaea lay across the heart of the planet, a patchwork of smaller continents now drifted, each carrying its own mountains, rivers, forests, and living things. The great interior deserts gave way to coastal lands where the air was softened by sea breezes, and the ancient mountain chains eroded into rolling hills and fertile plains. The world had entered a new chapter, one in which distance would shape the destinies of life as much as proximity once had. The Atlantic Ocean grew steadily between the continents that would become the Americas on one side and Africa and Europe on the other. What began as a narrow channel, where salt water seeped into rift valleys, became a vast expanse that would one day cradle storms, currents, and migrating life. Shorelines lengthened into intricate curves of bays and peninsulas, and the meeting of land and sea became a place of endless variety. Estuaries rich with nutrients, tidal flats feeding flocks of birds, rocky coasts battered into sculptures by the steady rhythm of waves. Life adapted eagerly to these new borders, and with the oceans came currents that carried warmth and coolness around the globe in new ways, redistributing climates and drawing new maps for survival. In the southern hemisphere, Gondwana began to loosen its bonds. Africa drifted northward, on a slow voyage that would eventually close the ancient Tethys Ocean and raise the Alpine and Himalayan mountain belts. India, once tucked against Antarctica and Australia, broke away and began its astonishing sprint north, moving faster than most continents ever travel. Its collision with Asia was still tens of millions of years in the future, but the momentum was building. An inevitable meeting that would thrust the highest peaks on Earth skyward. Australia and Antarctica lingered together for a while longer, joined in cold southern waters, but even they would part, their separation giving birth to new currents that would circle the poles and change the planet's climate yet again. This scattering was more than the splitting of stone, it was the opening of biological frontiers. When Pangaea was whole, species could walk, crawl, or fly from one end of the land to the other, crossing environments without ever needing to cross an ocean. But as the land broke apart, populations were divided. Isolation is one of evolution's most patient tools. Separated by seas, species began to diverge, their paths branching in quiet increments over countless generations. The descendants of a single ancestor could become many, each fitted to its corner of the new world. Marsupials thriving in Australia, giant flightless birds ruling southern islands, and mammals diversifying into an array of forms in the northern continents. The oceans themselves became arenas of change, with marine life adapting to the shifting currents, temperatures, and depths of the new seaways. The continents themselves carried with them the geological signatures of their shared past. Mountain belts that once stretched unbroken across Pangaea now lay in fragments on different shores, silent witnesses to the union that had been. Fossils of identical plants and animals rested in rock layers now separated by thousands of kilometers of water. Their presence on both sides of the divide a quiet reminder that the continents had once been neighbours. Even the patterns of ancient glaciation, preserved as scoured rock and striations in the bedrock, matched across lands now far apart. Proof that they had shared the same cold breath of ice sheets long ago, and yet for all the changes, the slow breath of the earth continued. The mantle churned beneath, the plates drifted, collided, and subducted, and the oceans opened and closed in their patient rhythm. In this long view, the rise and fall of supercontinents is less a singular event than a heartbeat, a steady cycle in the life of the planet. Scientists believe we are somewhere in the middle of that cycle now, in an age when the continents are scattered but still drifting toward their next meeting. One vision of the future imagines them converging into a new supercontinent, perhaps one that will form in the far north and be called Amasia. In that age, the map will look nothing like ours, and the climates and life will be reshaped once again by the geography of the moment. Standing in our time, it is humbling to remember that the map we know is temporary. The coastlines we cherish, the mountains we climb, the islands we imagine as solitary, these are waypoints, not destinations. They are moments in an endless rearrangement of the surface. To the Earth, there is no final shape, only the ongoing conversation between heat and stone, between gravity and buoyancy, between the deep mantle's currents and the crust it carries. Every mountain chain is a sentence in that conversation, every ocean basin a pause before the next thought. And so, the story of Pangaea's rise and fall is also the story of the Earth's restlessness. It tells us that even what feels solid and eternal is part of a moving design. It tells us that the boundaries we draw are not fixed lines, but shifting edges in a grand, slow dance. It tells us that life has always adapted to these movements, finding new homes and new shapes as the land and sea change places. To imagine Pangaea's single sweep of land is to imagine the unity of the Earth's crust. To watch it break apart is to witness the diversity that distance can bring. Both are necessary. Both are beautiful. Picture now the closing moment of Pangaea's tale. The continents have drifted far enough that their shorelines no longer match, their shared mountain belts no longer align. The animals and plants that once roamed freely across the supercontinent have diverged into distinct forms, each suited to the conditions of its part of the world. The oceans, once narrow and young, have widened into vast, deep bodies that cradle storms, migrations, and currents that encircle the globe. Above it all, the same sun that rose over a united land now lights a scattered mosaic of continents and seas, each carrying the memory of the whole from which it came. The Earth turns, its surface still moving, still reshaping, still writing the next chapter of its long, unhurried story. And somewhere beneath our feet in the deep mantle, the slow convection currents are already setting the stage for the next gathering. In a future so distant we can only imagine it, the scattered pieces will once again drift together. A new supercontinent will rise, built from the remnants of the old, and the cycle will begin again. The mountains will rise and fall, the oceans will open and close, and life will adapt, as it always has, to the changing face of the planet. This is the rhythm of Earth, a rhythm we cannot hear in a single lifetime, but one that has been playing since the beginning and will continue for as long as the planet breathes. In that rhythm lies both the memory of Pangaea and the promise of worlds yet to come, each as temporary and as eternal as the ones before. Before Pangaea, before the shape of the world was anything like the one we know, there was another gathering of land, a supercontinent older by hundreds of millions of years, born in a time when life itself was still learning how to build the forms we now take for granted. This ancient world was called Rodinia. The name comes from a Russian word meaning motherland, and in a way was the mother of all later continents, the parent from which the next chapters of Earth's geography would grow. Rodinia's time lies in the deep Proterozoic eon, around 1 billion years ago, when the planet's atmosphere and oceans were still evolving in ways that would set the stage for the complex life to come. To imagine Rodinia, you must clear your mind of familiar coastlines. The outlines we know, Africa, South America, Asia, Australia were not yet drawn. The land masses that would one day carry those shapes were fused together in a design both alien and beautiful, surrounded by a vast single ocean scientists call Morovia. Morovia's waters were the mirror in which Rodinia's bulk was reflected. Unlike the later supercontinent Pangaea, which stretched roughly east to west, Rodinia's body was oriented differently. Geological reconstruction suggests that much of the land lay near the equator, though pieces extended into higher latitudes, touching cooler seas. The air above this ancient world was thinner in oxygen than today's, but far richer than in even earlier eons, thanks to the slow work of cyanobacteria and early algae that had been breathing oxygen into the atmosphere for more than 1 billion years. In the shallow seas around Rodinia's shores, microbial mats carpeted the seafloor, building structures called stromatolites, layered mounds that trapped and bound sediment, growing in slow, patient rhythms that could last centuries. These living carpets were among the most important engineers of the early biosphere, changing the chemistry of oceans and skies in ways that made possible the rise of larger, more complex creatures. Rodinia itself was a patchwork quilt of cratons, ancient stable pieces of continental crust that had formed over the preceding billions of years. Each craton carried the scars of older collisions, volcanic arcs, and mountain-building events, stitched together by belts of deformed rock where smaller land masses had merged. The assembly of Rodinia was not a single moment but a long process, perhaps lasting from about 1.3 to 0.9 billion years ago. It began when earlier continents drifted together under the guidance of the same deep mantle currents that move the plates today. Ocean basins closed, mountain ranges rose where the crust buckled, and volcanic arcs were caught in the squeeze and welded onto larger masses. In some places, this welding was so complete that the seams became almost invisible. In others, the sutures remain obvious even now, hundreds of millions of years later, in the form of ancient mountain belts preserved on different continents. To stand on Rodinia in that time would have been to see a world in which the land was more isolated than ever. With so much of Earth's crust fused into one mass, the interior of the supercontinent lay far from the moderating influence of the sea. The climate there would have swung between extremes, hot in the long summers when the sun baked the bare rock and sparse vegetation, cold in winters when the winds swept across without barriers. Near the coasts, conditions were softer, but even there, the world was different. The life of the land was simple compared to what we know, mats of lichens and algae, perhaps some early moss-like plants clinging to damp ground. The real abundance of life was still in the seas, where the variety of single-celled organisms, early multicellular algae, and the first animal-like forms was steadily increasing. Geologists studying the rocks from Rodinia's time find clues in the form of ancient sediments and igneous intrusions. The orientation of magnetic minerals frozen into volcanic rocks tells us where the poles were relative to the land at the time they cooled, helping scientists reconstruct the arrangement of the continents. Matching belts of metamorphic rock, formed under the heat and pressure of continental collisions, appear on now distant continents, fitting together like jigsaw pieces once pressed against each other. These geological memories are the fingerprints of Rodinia's birth, preserved across the globe in fragments that must be carefully compared and reassembled. During Rodinia's reign, Earth's atmosphere and oceans were in delicate balance. The carbon dioxide levels in the air were influenced by the slow weathering of the vast continental crust, which drew the gas down and locked it into carbonate rocks. At the same time, volcanic activity returned CO2 to the air, keeping the climate from plunging into deep freeze. Yet the equilibrium was fragile. Evidence suggests that during Rodinea's later life this balance tipped, and the planet entered one of the most extreme ice ages in its history, the cryogenian glaciations, sometimes called snowball Earth events. Glaciers advanced far from the poles, and ice may have covered the oceans almost entirely, though perhaps with thin equatorial belts of open water. If such a frozen world existed, it would have been a stark sight from Rodinea's shores. Ice stretching beyond the horizon, the sound of the sea replaced by the grinding of glaciers. These frozen episodes, as harsh as they sound, may have played a key role in shaping life's future. The long ice ages could have driven evolutionary pressures that encouraged the emergence of more complex multicellular life in the aftermath. Nutrients locked in ice were released in pulses when the world thawed, feeding blooms of algae and fueling the base of the food chain. The breakup of Rodinia itself may have been tied to these climatic shifts. As the supercontinent rifted apart, new ocean basins formed, and the increased area of shallow seas allowed for more life-rich environments. The arrangement of land and sea also reshaped ocean currents and wind patterns, altering the global climate once again. The breakup of Rodinia was thought to have begun around 750 million years ago. Like Pangaea's eventual division, it started with the upwelling of hot mantle plumes that swelled and cracked the crust. Rift valleys deepened, volcanic activity increased, and the continents began to drift apart. New oceans, such as the Panthalassic and Proto-Iapetus, opened between the departing fragments. Pieces of Rodinia wandered into new positions, setting the stage for the next supercontinent cycle. Among the drifting fragments were cratons that would one day become the heart of modern continents: Laurentia, the ancient core of North America; Baltica, ancestral to much of Europe; Siberia, and the building blocks of Gondwana. The legacy of Rodinia is written not only in geology, but in the evolution of life. Its existence and breakup coincided with profound environmental changes that may have spurred the diversification of early multicellular organisms. By altering the arrangement of continents and oceans, Rodinia's life cycle reshaped the climate, the chemistry of the seas, and the pathways available for life to spread. Its story reminds us that the slow choreography of continents is not just a matter of stone, but a driver of biological history. To think of Rodinia is to think of a world both alien and foundational, a stage on which the earliest acts of complex life were rehearsed. The winds that swept its bare interiors, the tides that lapped against its microbial shores, the glaciers that carved its rocks, all were part of the same vast experiment that continues today in different forms. The land beneath our feet, no matter where we stand, carries fragments of that ancient whole. Somewhere in the grain of a granite boulder, in the tilt of a mountain range, in the chemical memory of an old seabed, is a piece of Rodinia's story. And like all supercontinents, it was both a beginning and an ending, its shape fleeting in the deep time of Earth, its influence lasting far beyond the life of its form. The breakup of Rodinia was not a sudden collapse, but a slow parting, stretched across tens of millions of years, as if the land itself were reluctant to let go of the shape it had held for so long. The first signs came deep within the earth, where rising plumes of hot mantle rock pressed upward, heating and thinning the crust above. At the surface, the earliest evidence of this change appeared as rift valleys, long, low depressions flanked by fault-scarred highlands. Volcanic activity marked these birthplaces of separation, with lava pouring from fissures and cooling into dark basalt, a kind of geological handwriting that we can still read today in the scattered remnants on different continents. These rifts were not isolated events. They appeared in multiple regions of Rodinia, opening seams that would one day become the outlines of entirely new oceans. As the rifting progressed, the landmasses that once fit snugly together began to drift apart. Where the crust was stretched thin enough, seawater found its way into the lowlands, forming narrow gulfs and seaways that widened with each passing million years. The superocean Morovia, which had once wrapped unbroken around Rodinia's bulk, began to send its waters into the spaces between the separating continents. New coastlines emerged, raw and unmeasured, where waves began their slow, patient work of shaping headlands, beaches and bays. In these young marginal seas, life found fertile ground. Shallow waters flooded with sunlight became nurseries for algae, sponges and early animal forms, feeding the slow expansion of the food web. The rearrangement of land and sea had profound effects on the planet's climate. When Rodinia was whole, much of its interior lay far from any moderating ocean, leading to extreme seasonal swings. As the continents pulled apart, more regions fell under the influence of marine climates, softening these extremes. At the same time, the creation of new ocean basins altered global circulation patterns. Currents carried warmth into higher latitudes and brought cold water toward the equator in new ways, redistributing heat and reshaping the conditions for life everywhere. Geological evidence suggests that these shifts may have helped trigger these severe cryogenian glaciations, with ice advancing far from the poles and possibly covering much of the planet. These snowball Earth events are among the most dramatic episodes in our planet's history. Glaciers ground across tropical latitudes, leaving behind dropstones, large rocks carried by ice and dropped into fine marine sediments when the ice melted, that are now found in places that should never have been cold. Some scientists believe that oceans may have been sealed beneath thick ice from pole to pole, with only thin equatorial belts of open water. Others suggest a slush ball Earth, with more extensive open water. Either way, the world would have been stark and glittering under a cold sun, its life pressed into the margins where conditions still allowed survival. Photosynthetic organisms may have clung to ice-free refuges, while deep-sea hydrothermal vents offered pockets of warmth and nutrients for those able to live without sunlight. Paradoxically, such extremes may have set the stage for life's next great leap forward. The long freeze could have acted as an evolutionary bottleneck, pruning less adaptable forms and favouring those with new survival strategies. When the ice retreated, the sudden release of nutrients from glacial meltwater fueled explosive blooms of algae, enriching the oceans and supporting more complex food chains. In the geological blink that followed, some of the earliest animals appeared, soft-bodied forms like those preserved in the Ediacaran fossils, hinting at the experiments in body design that would soon blossom in the Cambrian explosion. Meanwhile, the tectonic story continued. Fragments of Rodinia wandered across the globe, colliding with volcanic arcs and microcontinents, breaking again and drifting onward. Laurentia, the ancient core of North America, moved away from its former neighbours toward what would one day be the centre of the Iapetus Ocean. Baltica began its own migration, setting up future collisions that would build mountain ranges in what is now Europe. The pieces that would one day assemble into Gondwana drifted into the southern hemisphere, gathering into a new but temporary union. The shifting arrangements of these continental blocks reshaped the patterns of shallow seas, creating countless new habitats along their fringes. In these changing waters, life diversified quietly but steadily. The simple microbial mats that had dominated shallow seas for billions of years shared space with early multicellular algae, small tubular animals, and filter-feeding organisms. The chemistry of the oceans was changing too. Increased weathering of the exposed continental crust delivered a steady flow of minerals into the seas, influencing nutrient cycles and helping to raise oxygen levels. By the end of Rodinia's breakup, oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere and oceans were higher than at any previous time in Earth's history, paving the way for more energy-demanding forms of life. On land, the scene was still sparse. True plants had not yet taken hold, and the continent's interiors were bare rock, sand and dust, shaped by wind and water into landscapes both harsh and striking. In some places, thin films of microbial life coated damp surfaces, and primitive lichens may have begun their slow work of breaking down rock into soil. The lack of vegetation meant erosion was fast, with rivers carrying vast loads of sediment into coastal waters. These sediments built broad deltas and continental shelves, further expanding the shallow marine habitats where life thrived. If you could watch the process of Rodinia's breakup sped up into a few minutes, the continents would seem almost alive, stretching, tearing and drifting apart like pieces of dough under invisible hands. Mountain ranges would rise in one place and vanish in another. Volcanoes would flare along rift zones, and new seas would widen into oceans, their shorelines curving and folding with the flecks of the crust. To our eyes it might seem chaotic, but beneath it all is the deep order of plate tectonics, the planet's way of recycling its surface and keeping its heat in motion. The legacy of this breakup reached far beyond the Proterozoic eon. The positions of the continents after Rodinia influenced the climate, ocean chemistry and evolutionary pathways for hundreds of millions of years. The ocean basins that formed during its dispersal would later close again as the continents moved toward their next great union, the assembly of Pannotia, around 600 million years ago. That too would be short-lived, giving way to yet another scattering and, eventually, to the rise of Pangaea. And so, Rodinia's story is not just about a single supercontinent, but about the repeating pulse of the Earth's crust, this grand cycle of assembly and breakup that has been shaping the planet for billions of years. It is about how land and life respond to each other's changes, how a shift in coastlines can echo in the patterns of the wind, the currents of the sea, and the branches of the evolutionary tree. It is a reminder that nothing on the surface is fixed, that even the mightiest arrangement of continents is a temporary design in the long, slow art of the earth. The stones under our feet today once lay in Rodinia's mountains and shores, and in the far future they will be part of another land, another map, another moment in the endless cycle. In the quiet aftermath of Rodinia's long dispersal, the Earth entered a time of rearrangement and renewal, as if the planet were drawing breath between great steps. The once unified landmass had splintered into drifting fragments, each carrying with it the ancient scars of collisions past, each moving along its own path under the slow command of mantle currents. These wandering continents were not aimless. Their motions followed the deeper patterns of the supercontinent cycle, the same grand rhythm that had assembled Rodinia and that would, in time, bring its pieces together again into new forms. In the spaces between them, newborn oceans swelled, their waters exploring basins fresh from the crust's opening seams. The shorelines they lapped against were raw and angular, still sharp from the tearing, but already waves were wearing them down, trading stone for sand and beginning the endless work of softening the world's edges. The climate during this scattered phase was in constant dialogue with the shifting geography. With more ocean spreading across the globe, marine climates reached further inland, taming the temperature extremes that had once ruled Redinia's vast interior. Ocean currents, guided by the positions of the continents, drew ribbons of warmth and cold into new patterns, redistributing heat and influencing where ice could grow and where it would melt away. The planet's memory of the cryogenian glaciations lingered in its systems, and though the great ice sheets had retreated, their legacy was written in the chemistry of the oceans, enriched with nutrients washed from freshly exposed rock. This pulse of nourishment, combined with higher oxygen levels, fed an expansion of life in the seas, a slow prelude to the coming bloom of animal diversity in the Ediacaran and Cambrian periods. Along the new coasts, life took advantage of every shallow shelf and protected bay. Stromatolite reefs continued their ancient work, while mats of algae carpeted the seafloor, feeding small soft-bodied creatures that grazed in silence. In deeper waters, plankton drifted in the currents, forming the foundation of food webs that now spanned greater distances than ever before. The separation of the continents created new evolutionary laboratories, isolated pockets where life could experiment, diverging from its relatives in other seas. These subtle shifts in isolation and connection were threads in the vast tapestry of evolution, threads that would, over time, weave the complex patterns of the modern biosphere. On land, the transformation was quieter. Without forest to hold them, the continent's surfaces were shaped quickly by rain, wind, and rivers. Great alluvial plains stretched out from young mountain belts, their sediments carried toward the coasts in braided river system. Some highlands were still fresh from collision, their peaks sharp and their slopes unstable. Others were already worn low, their bones smoothed by the relentless abrasion of the elements. The air itself was subtly changing. The partnership between life and geology, between photosynthesizers and weathering rock, was drawing down carbon dioxide and feeding the slow rise of atmospheric oxygen, altering the balance of gases that would define the conditions for future life. As millions of years passed, the fragments of Rodinia continued their migrations. Some drifted toward each other again, foreshadowing the assembly of Panotia, a brief supercontinent that would form around 600 million years ago. Others moved into positions that would shape the future outlines of Gondwana, Laurentia, and Baltica. Each motion, though imperceptible in the span of a human life, was part of the planet's patient choreography, a movement in the symphony of plate tectonics that has been playing for billions of years. The oceans that had opened between the departing fragments would one day close again, their floors consumed in the deep trenches of subduction zones as new collisions began. The legacy of Rodinia's fall was not just geological, it was biological and climatic, a transformation that touched every system on Earth. By breaking apart, the supercontinent had increased the length of the planet's coastlines, creating countless new habitats. It had rearranged the pathways of winds and currents, altering rainfall patterns and temperature gradients. It had reshaped the conditions under which life evolved, promoting diversity through isolation and connection alike. Even the great glaciations of the Cryogenian, harsh as they were, may have been sparked in part by the arrangements of land and sea that emerged during Rodinia's time, and in their wake, life emerged stronger, more varied, and more ready for the complex ecosystems that lay ahead. If you could stand on one of these drifting continents in the late stages of Redenia's story, you would see a horizon both familiar and strange. The sky, the wind, the play of sunlight on water, these would feel timeless. But the land beneath your feet would be moving, carrying you slowly toward a new configuration you could never imagine. The mountains in the distance might be the worn remnants of Redenia's assembly, their rocks forged in the heat of ancient collisions. The rivers would be carrying those rocks, grain by grain, toward the sea, where they would be laid down in layers that future worlds would read like pages in a book. And all around you, life would be quietly adjusting, shaping itself to fit the moment, as it always has. In the deep time perspective, the rise and fall of Redenia was one chapter in a story that stretches without end. Before it came Nuna, and before Nuna came other lost supercontinents, their names and outlines reconstructed from the clues left in surviving rocks. After Redenia came Panotia, then Gondwana, and eventually Pangaea. Each followed the same broad arc: assembly, reign, and breakup, each leaving its mark on the history of life. The repetition is not a cycle of sameness, but of renewal. Each new supercontinent forming under different conditions, with different species to inherit its lands and seas, and different climates to shape the possibilities of life. The Earth's crust is a restless mosaic, and Redenia was one of its grand designs, a design that endured for hundreds of millions of years and yet was still only temporary. Its memory is preserved in the matching geology of distant continents, in the patterns of ancient glaciations, in the fossils of life that lived and vanished along its shores. To trace that memory is to feel the scale of time itself, to understand that what seems eternal is only a moment in the slow heartbeat of the planet. And as we look forward, knowing that the continents are still moving, still following the deep currents of the mantle, we can be certain that there will be other Redenias, other gatherings of land, other oceans to wrap around them. Each will rise, each will fall, and each will leave behind a new arrangement of life and stone for the next age to inherit. Long after Redenia had broken apart and its fragments had wandered into new configurations, the Earth prepared another grand gathering of land. This time the story would be written in the slow convergence of pieces that had once been scattered across wide oceans, drawn together again by the steady pull of plate tectonics. Out of this long, patient motion, two great landmasses would emerge, Gondwana in the south and Laurasia in the north, each carrying the combined heritage of many smaller continents. Their formation, union, and eventual drifting apart would shape not only the geography of the planet, but the course of life for hundreds of millions of years. To imagine Gondwana and Laurasia is to picture a world in which the continents were fewer but larger, where distances were measured not just in miles but in eras, and where the patterns of climate, ocean, and evolution were woven tightly into the shapes of the land. Gondwana began its assembly in the wake of Redenia's dispersal, around 600 million years ago, during the late Precambrian. It was a vast and varied continent, made of what are now South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Arabian Peninsula. This southern supercontinent took shape through the collision and suturing of ancient cratons and smaller terrains, binding together a landmass that would span from polar to tropical latitudes. Its edges were fringed by mountain belts that rose where plates collided, ranges that have long since eroded, but whose roots still lie buried in the crust. Within Gondwana's boundaries, climates ranged from icy southern deserts to warm equatorial lowlands, and its coast touched multiple oceans, each carrying different patterns of currents and winds. Laurasia, the northern counterpart, would not fully form until much later, but its foundations were being laid in the early Paleozoic. Composed of what are now North America, Europe, and much of Asia, Laurasia's pieces were initially separated by oceans such as the Iapetus and the Rsteic. Over tens of millions of years, these waters narrowed as tectonic plates carried the continents toward one another. Volcanic arcs were caught in the convergence, adding their mass to the growing northern land. By the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, Laurasia's outlines were emerging, and the two great continents, north and south, were slowly being drawn toward a meeting that would eventually create the single sweep of Pangaea. Life on Earth during the rise of Gondwana and Laurasia was undergoing its own revolutions. In the seas, the Cambrian explosion had already filled the oceans with an astonishing diversity of creatures: trilobites, brachiopods, mollusks, and the first vertebrates. Coral reefs grew in warm shallows, and the deep waters teemed with predators and prey locked in the endless exchange of adaptation. On land, plants were beginning to spread from moist lowlands into broader territories, their roots breaking rock into soil and their leaves drawing carbon dioxide from the air. By the Silurian and Devonian periods, primitive forests of ferns, horsetails, and early seed plants were transforming the continent's surfaces, anchoring riverbanks, and feeding new cycles of erosion and sedimentation. Gondwana's size and position made it a powerful influence on climate. For much of its history, it lay over the South Pole, and vast ice sheets advanced across its southern reaches during repeated glaciations. These frozen periods left behind thick deposits of tillite, rock made from compacted glacial debris that geologists now find scattered across continents far apart, a testament to their shared icy past. In tropical regions of Gondwana, meanwhile, warm, humid climates nurtured coal swamps, where dense vegetation would one day be buried and transformed into rich seams of carbon. These swamps, with their towering club mosses and giant horsetails, were home to a growing array of arthropods and early amphibians, some of which ventured further from the water than any vertebrate before them. As Laurasia grew in the north, it too developed a range of climates, from equatorial rainforests to arid interiors. The closing of the Iapetus Ocean brought its constituent pieces into collision, building mountain ranges like the Appalachians, whose roots still run deep under the forests and cities of eastern North America. These mountains were young and rugged then, feeding rivers that carried sediment into inland seas. The richness of these environments supported diverse ecosystems, including the first large terrestrial vertebrates, amphibians that hunted in riverside forests, and early reptiles that carried their lives entirely onto land. The slow convergence of Gondwana and Laurasia was a process measured not in centuries but in hundreds of millions of years. As the Rsteic Ocean narrowed between them, the two continents began to exchange species along the edges where their climates and habitats met. In the seas, faunas that had evolved in isolation began to mix, creating new competitive pressures and opportunities. On land, the gradual approach set the stage for the great union of all continents into Pangaea, a union that would profoundly alter global climate and life. But before that final joining, Gondwana and Laurasia each reached their own peaks of size and influence. Gondwana, with its immense southern expanse, dictated much of the planet's atmospheric circulation, driving powerful monsoons and shaping the distribution of deserts and rainforests. Laurasia's position in the north influenced the flow of ocean currents, steering warmth toward the poles and cooling the equator in subtle but important ways. Together, they defined the framework of the Paleozoic world, a framework upon which the dramas of evolution, extinction, and renewal would play out. To walk along the edge of Gondwana in that age would have been to stand at the boundary of ancient worlds. The waves would carry the smell of warm seas rich with life, forests would hum with the calls of insects, and in the shadows the first reptiles would slip quietly between tree trunks. In the distance, mountains would rise where plates collided, their summits sharp against the sky. On the far side of the world, Laurasia's shores would see their own sunsets, and the winds across its plains would carry the scent of different forests, different soils, different seas. And though no creature could know it then, these two great continents were already bound together by the deep, slow currents of the mantle, moving toward a union that would change the face of the earth once more. The gradual approach of Gondwana and Laurasia was a quiet inevitability, a journey carried on the backs of tectonic plates that moved no faster than the growth of a fingernail. For millions upon millions of years, the Arctic Ocean between them narrowed, its deep waters slowly giving way to shallower seas as the continents crept closer. Subduction zones along the edges of each supercontinent consumed the old ocean floor, pulling the land masses toward one another like invisible winches anchored deep in the earth. Along these margins, volcanic arcs flared to life, their slopes pouring lava into the air and ash into the skies. Earthquakes rumbled in the deep roots of the crust as the plates ground together, while sediment from eroding highlands filled the narrowing basins. The stage for collision was being set, though its final act was still tens of millions of years away. In the southern reaches of Gondwana, the vast ice sheets waxed and waned with the planet's changing climate. Each glacial advance scoured the landscape, carving valleys into the bedrock, pushing ridges of debris ahead of their frozen fronts. When the ice retreated, it left behind broad plains of till and boulder fields, scarred with the marks of its slow retreat. Closer to the equator, Gondwana's coal swamps spread across low-lying floodplains, their dense vegetation soaking up carbon dioxide from the air and locking it away in the peaty soils. These swamps were lush with giant club mosses, horsetails and ferns, their canopy providing shade for amphibians and early reptiles that hunted in the damp undergrowth. Insects, some of them enormous by modern standards, filled the air with the whir of wings. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a human hand hunted over still ponds, while millipede-like arthropods as long as a person crawled among the fallen leaves. Laurasia in the north was a land of contrasts. Along its coasts, shallow seas teemed with brachiopods, crinoids, corals and ammonites, their shells and skeletons building reefs that curved around the edges of continents. Inland, rivers carried sediment from rising mountain belts like the Appalachians and the Caledonides, laying it down in vast deltas and alluvial plains. Early conifer-like plants began to appear in some regions, their seeds adapted for dispersal without water, allowing them to colonize drier lands far from the moist habitats of ferns and horsetails. These new plants brought with them changes in soil chemistry and structure, further transforming the environments they occupied. The approach of Gondwana and Laurasia had far-reaching effects on global climate. As the continents closed in, the circulation of the ocean shifted, redirecting currents and altering the transport of heat across the globe. Seasonal patterns changed as well. Monsoons strengthened in some regions while others became increasingly arid. In the southern hemisphere, the immense size of Gondwana allowed winds to sweep unbroken across thousands of kilometers, driving powerful ocean currents that influenced weather far beyond its shores. In the north, Laurasia's growing landmass began to exert its own influence, shaping atmospheric circulation in ways that brought new patterns of rainfall and drought. Marine life responded to the changing seaways. As the Rheaic Ocean narrowed, species that had once been separated by vast distances found themselves in closer contact, leading to both competition and hybridization of faunas. Coral reef communities shifted as ocean chemistry changed with the closing of basins. Plankton species adapted to new nutrient regimes, their tiny shells settling into sediments that would one day become chalk and limestone, recording the chemistry of ancient seas. On the continental shelves, fish diversified into new ecological roles, some adapting to shallow, weedy environments, while others prowled the deeper waters along the continental slope. On land, the Carboniferous and Permian periods saw evolutionary milestones. The first true amniotes, vertebrates that could lay eggs with protective shells, spread across the continents, freeing them from the need to return to water to reproduce. These early reptiles evolved into a variety of forms, some small and insect-eating, others larger and herbivorous, feeding on the lush vegetation of coal swamps and upland forests. Insects developed new wing shapes and flight strategies, filling the air with their buzzing and fluttering. The interplay between plants and animals was deepening, with seeds, spores and pollen becoming part of the diets and behaviours of many creatures. The eventual collision between Gondwana and Laurasia would culminate in the formation of the supercontinent Pangaea. But even before that final union, smaller collisions between the edges of their constituent landmasses were already raising new mountain ranges. When volcanic arcs or microcontinents were caught between the converging giants, they were crushed and uplifted, adding new peaks and ridges to the global landscape. These mountains altered local climates, casting rain shadows that created deserts in their lee and funneling moisture into valleys where new rivers carved their courses. The sediments eroded from these ranges built fertile floodplains that became cradles for evolving life. From a human perspective, the pace of these changes was imperceptible. A river valley might widen only a few meters in a lifetime. A mountain might rise no more than the thickness of a hand in a century. But in the deep time of the earth, these motions were steady and unyielding, and their combined effects would reshape the face of the planet. The slow closing of the Rheaic Ocean, the rearrangement of currents, the uplift of the mountains, and the spread of new life forms were all threads in the same tapestry. A tapestry that would, in time, show the great sweep of Pangaea stretching across the globe. In the quiet spaces between these grand geologic events, life went on. Plants grew and died, their remains sinking into the peat that would one day become coal. Rivers shifted their courses, leaving behind oxbow lakes where amphibians lurked in still waters. Storms rolled across forests, toppling trees and opening gaps for new growth. The sun rose and set over continents that were slowly drawing closer, unaware of the epic union to come. And all the while, beneath the surface, the mantle continued its steady, unseen labour, carrying the continents forward in a journey that had begun long before and would continue long after any single configuration had passed into memory. The slow convergence of Gondwana and Laurasia finally culminated in a union that reshaped the face of the Earth, a union that, for a time, erased the vast ocean between them and gave rise to the supercontinent Pangaea. But before that final continuous sweep of land was complete, the last phases of their approach were marked by a series of powerful collisions, mountain-building events, and climatic transformations that left a permanent mark on the planet's history. The Arctic Ocean, once a deep and vibrant realm of marine life, became narrower and shallower until its floor was consumed in subduction zones. As the final strips of oceanic crust disappeared beneath the edge of the continents, the contact between Gondwana and Laurasia grew unavoidable. When they met, the crust did not yield easily, its resistance expressed in the form of the immense pressure that crumpled rock into towering mountain belts. Among these were the ranges that would one day be known as the Central Pangaean Mountains, stretching across what is now eastern North America, Western Europe, and northwestern Africa. These mountains were massive, their peaks sharp and young, casting shadows across new valleys and altering the course of rivers that once flowed unhindered to the sea. With the continents now locked together, the world entered a new phase of climatic unity. Pangaea's vast size meant that large portions of its interior lay far from the moderating influence of the ocean, giving rise to extreme seasonal variations, hot summers that baked the land and cold winters that froze it hard. Deserts sprawled across much of the supercontinent's interior, where winds carried dust for hundreds of kilometers and rains were rare. Along the coasts, conditions were softer, with lush forests and wetlands, while in the tropics, monsoonal patterns brought intense seasonal rainfall that supported diverse ecosystems. This contrast between interior dryness and coastal fertility was one of the defining features of Pangaea's climate, shaping the distribution of life across its expanse. The ecosystems that developed during this time were rich with evolutionary experiments. In the early stages of Gondwana and Laurasia's union, the Carboniferous coal swamps still held sway in some tropical regions, but as the climate dried, these wet habitats gave way to open woodlands and arid adapted plants. Seed-bearing gymnosperms, conifers, cycads and ginkgos spread widely, their tough seeds allowing them to survive in more challenging conditions than their spore-reliant predecessors. Insects adapted as well, with some groups shrinking in size as oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to decline from the exceptional highs of the Carboniferous. Amphibians, so dependent on moist environments, retreated to wetter regions, while reptiles flourished, their amniotic eggs giving them freedom from water-bound reproduction and allowing them to colonize the drier interiors. In the seas, the closure of the Reykjavik and other ocean basins brought together marine species that had evolved in isolation, leading to both competition and diversification. Reef systems changed in structure as dominant coral and sponge groups shifted in response to new water chemistries. Ammonites, coiled-shelled mollusks, expanded their ranges, while fish lineages continued to evolve, including the ancestors of many modern shark groups. Along the newly formed continental margins, nutrient-rich upwellings fueled plankton blooms that supported abundant marine life, from small filter feeders to large predators. The tectonic forces that united Gondwana and Laurasia also created zones of instability along their sutures. Earthquakes were common in these regions, and volcanic eruptions periodically darkened the skies. Lava flows covered large swathes of land in places, adding fresh rock to the growing continental mass. The heat and pressure of the collisions metamorphosed deep crustal rocks, forging new minerals and altering the fabric of the lithosphere. Over time, erosion began its slow dismantling of the mountain belts, carrying sediments into inland basins and along the coasts, where they formed thick layers of sandstone, shale, and limestone. These sedimentary records would one day tell the story of the continent's final approach and union. For the life that inhabited this united world, the joining of Gondwana and Laurasia was both an opportunity and a challenge. Species that had evolved separately came into contact, sometimes merging into shared ecosystems, sometimes driving one another to extinction. Migratory paths opened across the supercontinent, allowing animals to move between distant regions without crossing oceans. Plants spread their seeds into new soils, carried by wind, water, and animals over vast distances. But the expansion of deserts and the drying of former wetlands forced many species into narrower ecological niches, sharpening the pressures of natural selection. The scale of Pangaea's formation is difficult to comprehend in human terms. Entire mountain ranges rose and were worn down again in the time it took for the continents to fully lock together. Seas opened and closed, and climates shifted from ice-bound to sweltering and back again. Yet from the perspective of the Earth, this was a single act in a much larger play, a temporary arrangement in the endless rearrangement of its crust. Gondwana and Laurasia, once separate realms with their own internal landscapes and life histories, were now one, their borders erased by collision, but their origins still written in the rocks. Even in its completeness, the supercontinent carried within it the seeds of its own breakup. The same mantle currents that had drawn the continents together would, in time, change their patterns, sending plumes of heat upward into the crust. Weaknesses along old sutures would eventually become the sites of rifting, and new oceans would begin to open. But for the moment, the Earth stood in a rare configuration, one great landmass encircled by a single vast ocean, Panthalassa, and a smaller inland sea, the Tethys, cradled between its arms. It was a moment of geological unity, a pause in the cycle before the long process of separation began again. Standing on a high ridge in Pangaea's early days, you could look out over endless land, the horizon softened by distance and haze. Rivers would wind through valleys far below, carrying the runoff from mountain storms toward the distant sea. Forests and open plains would stretch as far as the eye could see, broken only by the rising walls of other ranges. The wind would carry scents from both near and far, pine resin from upland groves, the dry tang of desert air, the salty whisper of the ocean somewhere beyond sight. It would be a world both immense and unified, its landscapes connected by continuous ground, yet within it, the differences in climate, life and terrain would make each region distinct, and as the sun set on such a scene, the shadows of the mountains would lengthen across a land that had once been two, now one, bound together by the deep and patient work of the earth. If you could step outside of time and watch the surface of the earth from far above, you would see the continents not as fixed shapes but as restless travellers, gliding slowly across the planet's curved skin. They are pieces of crust riding on currents in the mantle, shifting and turning, sometimes drifting apart, sometimes drifting together. Over hundreds of millions of years, their movement traces patterns as intricate as a slow dance, one in which partners exchange places, break apart, and rejoin in endlessly changing arrangements. This restless movement is what geologists call plate tectonics, and it is the force behind the rise and fall of supercontinents. The continent's journey is not random, it follows the flow of heat within the planet, the opening and closing of oceans, the birth and death of mountain ranges. To understand their wandering is to understand the deeper rhythm of the Earth itself. The crust of our planet is not a single unbroken shell. It is divided into tectonic plates, some carrying continents, some entirely beneath the oceans. These plates float on the softer, warmer rock of the mantle below, moving because of convection currents driven by the Earth's internal heat. Where mantle rock rises, it pushes plates apart, creating mid-ocean ridges where new crust forms. Where mantle rock sinks, it drags plates down into trenches, recycling old crust back into the deep Earth. Continents, thick and buoyant, are caught in this flow, unable to sink but always moving, carried along by the slow churn beneath. This movement is so gradual that it is invisible to human eyes, just a few centimeters a year, but given enough time, it rearranges the entire face of the planet. Over the last billion years, this slow motion has created a repeating cycle of supercontinents forming and breaking apart. Before Pangaea, there was Rodinia. Before Rodinia, there was Nuna. Each was assembled when smaller continents drifted together, colliding with enough force to crumple their edges into mountain belts. Each broke apart when mantle currents beneath them shifted, thinning the crust in some places and pulling the land apart into new configurations. The journey between these moments of unity and separation is what gives us the continents we know today, scattered across the globe yet still moving toward new destinations in the far future. When continents drift apart, they open new oceans. Along the seams of separation, molten rock rises to form mid-ocean ridges, and as the plates move, more crust is added to the ocean floor. The widening sea changes global patterns of wind and water, shaping climate and life. Over time, the ocean floor is carried toward a subduction zone, where it bends and hides back into the mantle, melting into magma that may feed volcanic arcs. These processes close oceans as surely as they open them, bringing continents together again. This opening and closing is called the Wilson cycle, and it operates on timescales of hundreds of millions of years, endlessly repeating, endlessly rearranging. The wandering of continents has left its mark everywhere. In the rocks of mountain ranges, you can read the story of ancient collisions, layers once horizontal now tilted and folded, minerals formed under crushing pressures, seams where two plates welded together. In the sediments of ancient oceans, now turned to stone, you can find fossils of marine creatures that once lived far from any shoreline. Even in the matching shapes of today's continents, South America's bulge fitting into Africa's curve, you can see the memory of past unions. The fit is not perfect because erosion and deposition have reshaped the edges over millions of years, but the match is close enough to reveal their shared history. Continental drift affects far more than the land itself. It shapes the climate by changing the positions of land masses relative to the poles and the equator. When continents cluster near the poles, ice sheets can grow, reflecting sunlight and cooling the planet. When they gather near the equator, more heat is absorbed, warming the climate. The arrangement of continents also controls the flow of ocean currents, which move heat around the globe and influence rainfall, storm patterns, and even the distribution of nutrients in the sea. These changes ripple outward into the living world, guiding the evolution and migration of species. The wandering crust also creates and destroys habitats. When continents merge into a supercontinent, coastlines shrink, reducing the shallow marine environments that are often the richest in life. Vast interiors far from the sea may become dry and inhospitable. When continents split apart, new coastlines form, creating long stretches of habitat for marine and coastal species. The isolation of landmasses after a breakup can lead to new evolutionary paths as species adapt to their separate environments, a process called allopatric speciation. The breakup of Pangaea, for example, isolated dinosaurs on different continents, leading to distinct lineages that evolved independently for tens of millions of years. From the perspective of deep time, the continent's wandering is ceaseless. Right now, Africa is slowly pushing into Europe, closing the Mediterranean Sea. Australia is drifting north toward Asia. The Atlantic Ocean is widening as North and South America move away from Europe and Africa. In the far future, these motions will bring the continents together again into a new supercontinent. Scientists have proposed names like Amasia or Pangaea Proxima for this future landmass. The details of its shape and position are uncertain, but the certainty lies in the motion itself. The plates will keep moving, the map will keep changing. Standing on a modern coastline, it is difficult to imagine the shore beneath your feet once joined to a distant land. But in the language of rocks, the story is clear. A grain of sand on a beach may have been part of a mountain on another continent hundreds of millions of years ago. A cliff face may hold shells from a sea that vanished before mammals even existed. A granite outcrop may be the remnant of an ancient collision that took place when the continents were arranged in a way no living eye has seen. These pieces of the past are all around us, if we know how to read them. The wandering continents are not merely a backdrop to the story of life, they are active participants. By shaping climates, connecting and separating habitats, and altering the chemistry of oceans and atmosphere, they have influenced every major chapter in the history of life on Earth. They will continue to do so for as long as the planet remains geologically active. Every shoreline, every mountain range, every ocean basin we know today is a temporary arrangement in the grand choreography of the plates, a dance that began billions of years ago and will continue until the Earth's heat runs low and the crust grows still. It is humbling to realize that the continents beneath us are as temporary as clouds, just slower. The land that feels so permanent is drifting toward a future we will never see, carrying with it the memory of past unions and separations. In the vast expanse of time, each arrangement is a passing pattern, beautiful in its moment, destined to change. The wandering crust is the planet's way of breathing, of renewing its surface, of keeping the cycle of life and stone in motion. And as long as the Earth moves, the continents will wander, tracing paths across the globe that no map can hold forever. When continents wander, their movement is rarely a smooth glide. Instead, it is punctuated by collisions, rifting, and the rise of great mountains, moments when the crust buckles under pressure or pulls apart to reveal molten rock from below. Each collision leaves behind a chain of mountains, their roots deep in the crust, their summits exposed to the sky. Each rift births a seam of new ocean floor, a scar that slowly widens into a sea. Over time, these scars and folds are worn down by the work of wind, water, and ice. Their sediments carried into oceans to be buried, hardened, and eventually lifted again in some future mountain range. This endless recycling is part of what makes the Earth unique among the planets of our solar system. Its surface is not fixed but alive with motion, constantly renewing itself. Consider the Himalayas, the tallest mountains on Earth today. They are the result of the Indian plate drifting northward and colliding with Eurasia, a motion that began tens of millions of years ago when India broke away from the remnants of Gondwana. The speed of that journey, geologically speaking, was astonishing, more than twice the typical rate of plate movement. When India met Asia, the crust between them crumpled and rose, creating a mountain chain so high it reaches into the realm of perpetual snow. Even now, the collision continues, and the Himalayas are still rising while erosion carves deep valleys into their flanks. This is a snapshot of what happens whenever continents meet. The land deforms, mountains grow, and the planet's surface is rewritten. Rifting is the other side of this story. Where mantle plumes rise beneath a continent, heat thins the crust until it fractures, creating long valleys that may fill with water and eventually open into oceans. The East African Rift is one such place in the making, a system of valleys, lakes, and volcanoes marking where the African plate is slowly splitting. In millions of years, the eastern part of the continent may break away entirely, and a new ocean will take its place. This process has happened countless times before. The Atlantic Ocean, for example, began as a rift between Africa and South America, their matching coastlines still bearing the memory of their fit when they were part of Pangaea. The wandering of continents is deeply connected to the opening and closing of ocean basins. As one ocean grows, another shrinks, and the arrangement of continents shifts accordingly. These changes alter the planet's system of ocean currents, which in turn redistributes heat and moisture around the globe. When continents cluster together, ocean circulation can become restricted, affecting the exchange of heat between the equator and the poles. This can trigger ice ages or warm periods, influencing the long-term climate in ways that ripple through ecosystems. Conversely, when continents are spread far apart, wide oceans allow for strong, unimpeded currents that can transport heat more efficiently. Life has always responded to these shifts. The distribution of species, both on land and in the sea, often reflects the history of continental movement. Fossils of the same plant species have been found on continents now separated by oceans, evidence that those lands were once joined. Similarly, the fossil remains of animals like Mesosaurus, a small aquatic reptile, appear in both South America and Africa, but nowhere else, indicating that these continents were once part of the same connected world. When continents split apart, species are isolated from one another, and evolution takes separate paths. When continents join, species can mix, competing for resources and sometimes replacing each other entirely. The influence of drifting continents extends even to the composition of the atmosphere. When mountain ranges rise, their fresh rock is exposed to weathering, a process that draws carbon dioxide out of the air and locks it into carbonate minerals. This can cool the climate over millions of years. The uplift of the Himalayas, for example, may have contributed to the gradual cooling that led to the ice ages of the past few million years. In the opposite direction, large volcanic events associated with rifting can release vast amounts of carbon dioxide, warming the climate and, in some cases, contributing to mass extinctions. The pace of plate movement may seem glacial, but its effects over geological time are profound. At just a few centimeters per year, a continent can travel thousands of kilometers in the span of 100 million years. This is enough to carry a landmass from polar to tropical latitudes or from one hemisphere to the other, subjecting its ecosystems to dramatic climatic changes. Such migrations can transform deserts into rainforests, tundra into grasslands, and shallow seas into dry plains. The fossil record preserves evidence of these transformations, showing shifts in plant and animal communities that mirror the movement of the land beneath them. In our own time, the continents are still on the move. Africa's northward drift is closing the Mediterranean Sea, while Australia is approaching Southeast Asia. The Atlantic Ocean continues to widen, pushing the Americas farther from Europe and Africa. The Pacific Ocean, meanwhile, is slowly shrinking as its floor is consumed along subduction zones encircling it. These motions will, in the far future, rearrange the continents into a new configuration, perhaps another supercontinent. Whether it forms near the equator, at the pole, or somewhere in between will depend on the shifting patterns of mantle convection deep below. The wandering of continents is, at its heart, a story of balance between creation and destruction, between heat rising from the planet's core and the cooling of its surface, between the stability of the crust and the forces that deform it. It is a balance that has held for billions of years, allowing the Earth to recycle its surface and maintain conditions suitable for life. This constant motion has given us the landscapes we know, the mountains, valleys, and coasts that define our sense of place. It has shaped the climate patterns that determine where forests grow and deserts spread. And it has guided the migrations and evolutions of life itself, from the earliest microbes to the vast diversity of plants and animals we see today. From the long view, continents are not fixed nations of stone but nomads, endlessly travelling across the globe. Their paths are written not in human maps but in the deep record of the rocks, in the matching scars of ancient mountain belts, in the mirrored fossils of separated shores. They have been here long before us, and they will continue their journeys long after we are gone, carrying the story of the Earth forward in a language measured not in years or centuries, but in the deep time of the planet's breath. As night falls across the forest, the day's chorus fades into the quieter hum of nocturnal life, and a different rhythm takes over, one that belongs to the trees themselves. In daylight, they are busy with photosynthesis, turning sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into the sugars that fuel their growth. But at night, without sunlight to drive that process, their focus shifts. The leaves still move gases in and out, but now the balance changes. Instead of absorbing more carbon dioxide than they release, they respire like animals do, taking in oxygen, breaking down sugars, and releasing carbon dioxide back into the air. This is the quieter half of their breathing cycle, the part hidden from human eyes, yet it is just as essential as the work they do under the sun. The process is simple in chemistry but complex in purpose. Inside each cell, sugars made during the day are passed into tiny organelles called mitochondria. There, through cellular respiration, the sugars are broken apart, their stored energy released to power the work of living, repairing tissues, building new cell walls, maintaining the flow of water and nutrients through the plant's body. Oxygen, absorbed from the air through the same stomata that serve for photosynthesis, fuels this process. Carbon dioxide is the byproduct and it drifts back out into the night air, where it may feed nearby plants or rise to join the broader atmospheric cycle. This nocturnal breathing is steady, unhurried, and unending. It sustains the tree's life when the energy of the sun is out of reach. Yet there is more happening under moonlight than simple respiration. At night, many trees adjust their water balance, without the heat of the sun pulling moisture through their leaves in the process known as transpiration. Some species allow their stomata to close, conserving water. Others keep them partially open, a choice that can aid in cooling or allow for a slow intake of nutrients dissolved in water. This nighttime water movement, called nocturnal transpiration, varies from species to species, shaped by climate, soil moisture, and evolutionary history. In tropical forests where humidity remains high after dark, trees may continue this gentle flow all night long. In arid lands, the stomata may stay closed until dawn. The moon and stars play their part too. While trees do not rely on moonlight for photosynthesis, it is far too dim for that. They can respond subtly to lunar cycles. The gravitational pull of the moon affects not only the tides of the sea, but also the movement of water within trees. Some studies suggest that the swelling and shrinking of tree trunks across the lunar month may be tied to these tidal forces, influencing how water is distributed through their tissues. In this way, the moon's quiet pull becomes part of the nightly rhythm, an invisible hand that helps shape the life within the forest. Night is also a time of exchange between trees and the other beings that share their space. The carbon dioxide released by trees after sunset feeds the undergrowth, mosses, and fungi. Many of these nighttime partners return the favour in subtle ways. Mycorrhizal fungi trade nutrients for the sugars the trees produced in daylight, even as the trees rest from their photosynthetic labour. Insects, moths, and nocturnal mammals move among the trunks, pollinating flowers that open only in darkness, or dispersing seeds hidden in fruits that ripen at night. The forest under the moon is not asleep. It is simply engaged in a different kind of work. Breathing at night is not a weakness or reversal of the tree's role as a giver of oxygen. It is a necessity. Just as animals rest and repair in darkness, trees use the energy from their own stored food to sustain themselves through the hours when light is absent. The oxygen they release in daylight is made possible because they maintain their own living systems in this way, keeping their roots, branches, and leaves healthy and ready to capture the next day's sun. Without the steady, quiet respiration of night, the brilliant productivity of the day would falter. If you were to walk through a forest at night with senses tuned to the invisible, you might notice the air is slightly richer in carbon dioxide near the ground, the result of both plant and soil respiration. You might feel the subtle shift in humidity as trees adjust their water use. You might even sense, though not see, the microscopic activity within leaves, roots, and bark, each cell consuming oxygen and releasing energy. The moonlight filtering through the canopy would illuminate stillness, but beneath that stillness, countless processes continue, tying the forest into the broader web of life. By dawn, the balance will shift again. As the first rays of sunlight touch the leaves, chloroplasts awaken, photosynthesis begins, and the forest exhales oxygen in great abundance. But the work of the night will remain, folded into the strength of the trunks, the reach of the roots, the readiness of each leaf to meet the new day. In the long rhythm of life, day and night are not opposites but partners, each offering what the other cannot. The breathing of trees at night, gentle, hidden, and constant, is the counterpoint to their sunlit labour, the quiet half of a cycle that has been turning for hundreds of millions of years. And in that quiet, the forest under the moon continues to live, grow, and prepare for the light to return. The idea that trees breathe may seem strange at first, because their stillness gives the illusion of silence and passivity, but their lives are defined by a constant exchange with the air around them. In daylight, this is easy to imagine. Leaves catching sunlight, pulling in carbon dioxide and sending out oxygen. Yet this is only half the truth. The other half unfolds in the hours when the sun has slipped below the horizon, when shadows deepen between the trunks and moonlight pools on the forest floor. In that softer light, the great engines of photosynthesis fall quiet, and a slower, more ancient rhythm emerges, trees shifting from their role as givers of oxygen to that of breathers like us, taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide into the night air. This nocturnal respiration is as essential to their survival as their daylight work, a reminder that the forest's life is not bound to the sun alone. As darkness settles, the machinery inside each leaf changes focus. During the day, chloroplasts dominate, using sunlight to build sugars from carbon dioxide and water. At night, these chloroplasts rest and mitochondria take the lead. Here, in these tiny powerhouses, the sugars made earlier are broken apart to release energy. The reaction is much like our own breathing. Oxygen is drawn in, sugars are dismantled molecule by molecule, and the energy released fuels the countless microscopic tasks of living, repairing cell walls, maintaining nutrient flows, growing new tissue, and keeping every part of the tree alive through the hours without light. The carbon dioxide that results is released back through the same stomata that opened wide for photosynthesis during the day. Night also brings changes to the tree's relationship with water. Without the pull of sunlight to drive transpiration at full strength, many trees close their stomata to conserve moisture, especially in arid or temperate climates where water loss could be costly. But in wetter or tropical environments, some species keep their stomata partly open after dark. This gentle nocturnal water flow, known as night transpiration, can serve several purposes: cooling the leaves, aiding in nutrient transport from roots to canopy, or balancing internal water pressure. In this way, the tree remains subtly active, its physiology adjusting to match the conditions of the night. The moon itself, though it offers only a fraction of the sun's light, plays a more mysterious role. While moonlight is far too faint to drive meaningful photosynthesis, its cycles and its gravitational pull appear to influence water movement within trees. Just as the oceans respond to lunar tides, the water columns in a tree's xylem may subtly rise and fall with the moon's phases. Sensitive instruments have recorded minute expansions and contractions in tree trunks over the lunar month, hinting that this ancient satellite may be woven into the forest's heartbeat in ways we are only beginning to understand. In the hush of night, trees also engage with the rest of the forest in a different manner than they do by day. Through their roots and the vast underground networks of mycorrhizal fungi, they trade nutrients and chemical signals with neighbours. This exchange does not sleep. Sugars made during the day travel down to feed the roots and the fungi, while in return minerals gathered from the soil move upward. This partnership, hidden from sight, is part of what keeps forests resilient, allowing trees to share resources and even send warning signals about pests or drought. The nighttime respiration fuels this underground commerce, ensuring the network remains active when the canopy above is still. And so the forest's breathing after dark is not a pause in life but a transformation of it. The great pulse of oxygen released by day is balanced by the slower, quieter release of carbon dioxide at night. This exchange is part of the same cycle that has sustained forests for hundreds of millions of years, a cycle that nourishes not just the trees, but all the organisms linked to them. When we walk through a moonlit forest, the air may feel cool and still, but it carries the invisible traces of this respiration, the exhalations of trunks, branches, and leaves. These breaths mingle with those of soil microbes, animals, and fungi, creating an unseen atmosphere of life, a shared exhalation under the stars. By the time dawn begins to pale the horizon, the balance is ready to tip once again. As sunlight spills over the treetops, chloroplasts awaken and photosynthesis resumes. Oxygen production surges, carbon dioxide is drawn in, and the forest shifts back into its daytime mode. But the strength of this daytime work depends on the quiet labour of the night, the energy recovered, the tissues repaired, the hidden exchanges completed in darkness. In the unbroken loop of life, there is no idle hour, no wasted moment. Day and night weave together into a seamless fabric, each strengthening the other, each part of the same unending breath of the forest. In the long hours between sunset and sunrise, the respiration of trees is both a personal act of survival and a communal service to the forest. Each tree, whether towering high into the canopy or standing as a sapling in the understory, engages in a steady exchange of gases that sustains its own metabolism while subtly shaping the air its neighbours breathe. During daylight, forests act as immense carbon sinks, drawing in more carbon dioxide than they release. But at night, this balance reverses. Without sunlight to drive photosynthesis, the leaves, stems and roots all become net emitters of carbon dioxide, their mitochondria breaking down stored sugars to release the energy required for growth, repair and maintenance. This is not wasteful, it is the necessary cost of living, the quiet heartbeat that keeps each organism alive through the dark. The energy released by the nocturnal respiration powers processes that are easy to overlook but vital for survival. Within the cells, enzymes are repaired or replaced, membranes are maintained, and the molecular machinery that will be needed at dawn is checked and restored. Sugars are allocated to different parts of the plant according to need, some sent to the roots to fuel nutrient uptake, others to developing buds or expanding leaves. In seedlings, which must grow quickly to reach the light, respiration is especially intense at night, channeling energy into elongation and leaf expansion. In older trees, much of the energy goes into maintaining the vast, complex network of living tissue that stretches from root tip to highest leaf. Water movement, too, continues after sunset, though in patterns that differ from the day. The drop in temperature and the absence of strong transpiration demand often reduce water loss, yet in many species, sap still rises during the night. This can be driven by root pressure, as minerals absorbed from the soil draw water upward. Nocturnal transpiration, when stomata remain partially open in the dark, may facilitate cooling or allow the continued uptake of nutrients from the soil solution. In humid environments, where water loss is less risky, this gentle night flow can be substantial, helping to flush salts from the leaves and maintain the plant's internal balance. The air just above the forest floor undergoes its own transformation in the absence of sunlight. As leaves and soil organisms respire, carbon dioxide concentrations rise, sometimes reaching levels far above those of the daytime atmosphere. This denser air can linger in the stillness of the night, especially under a calm sky, before mixing more freely with the upper canopy and the broader atmosphere when the day warms. For animals that forage or move through the forest at night, this altered air chemistry is part of their environment, shaping their behavior and physiology. Insects, mammals, and birds all navigate this shifting mix, their own breathing adding to the night's collective exhalation. The moon's presence during these hours adds a subtle but intriguing influence. While its light is too faint to drive photosynthesis, the gravitational pull of the moon exerts small but measurable effects on water within plants. Like tides in the ocean, sap flow may experience tiny fluctuations that match the lunar cycle. In some studies, minute expansions and contractions in tree trunks have been observed over the course of a month, suggesting that even at this scale, celestial rhythms reach into the life of the forest. Though the biological significance of these lunar-linked changes is still a subject of research, their existence is a reminder that trees are connected not only to their immediate surroundings, but also to the broader forces that govern our planet. Below ground, the roots remain highly active through the night. Freed from the competing demands of photosynthesis, trees can devote more energy to exploring the soil for water and minerals. Fine root tips grow and branch, guided by gradients of moisture and nutrients. The mycorrhizal fungi entwined with these roots also remain active, exchanging phosphorus, nitrogen and other resources for the sugars supplied by the tree. This partnership is a continuous one, but night may offer an advantage for certain exchanges when temperatures are cooler and soil-water potential changes subtly with the rhythms of evaporation and condensation above. Night is also a time for signaling. Trees release volatile organic compounds, VOCs, into the air, some of which serve as defenses against herbivores, while others may act as messages to neighbouring plants. Certain stress signals, such as those triggered by drought or insect attack, can be emitted more strongly at night, perhaps because they are less likely to be broken down by sunlight. Through these chemical whispers, trees share information with one another, helping the forest respond as a community to threats and changes. The breathing of trees at night, then, is far more than a passive exchange of gases. It is an integrated, dynamic process tied to growth, water use, nutrient cycling, climate regulation, and communication. Each breath taken in and out is part of a chain reaction that links the forest floor to the canopy to the atmosphere, and the living forest to the patterns of the moon and stars. By the time the first pale light filters through the leaves, the work of the night has already prepared the forest for the day ahead. Energy is stored and ready to be spent, tissues are repaired, nutrients are in place, and the unseen ties between trees and their neighbours have been strengthened in the dark. In the balance between sunlight and shadow, it is the steady, unseen respiration of night that ensures the forest will wake ready to breathe again with the dawn. By the final hours of night, the forest is deep in its slow, steady rhythm, each tree breathing in a way that reflects both its individual needs and its place in the greater living system. The sugars formed during the previous day's photosynthesis are steadily consumed, powering cellular repair, supporting the quiet extension of roots into the soil, and fueling the subtle adjustments of leaves and branches as they prepare for the return of sunlight. Even the oldest trees, whose growth has slowed to the imperceptible pace of centuries, remain active in these dark hours, their immense trunks filled with living cells that need constant energy to maintain themselves. Respiration is not a pause from life, but life itself, continuing without the sun, the unbroken thread that carries each organism through the turning of the planet. In this dim, moonlit world, the forest air is heavier with carbon dioxide than it will be at any point in the coming day. The gas rises from leaves, stems, and the forest floor, where roots, fungi, and soil microbes contribute their own exhalations. In still conditions, a faint layering can occur, with the densest air pooling near the ground, moving only when a light breeze or temperature shift stirs it. The scent of this enriched air is subtle, a faint earthiness, carrying hints of leaf litter, damp wood, and unseen fungal blooms. For the small creatures of the night, moths, beetles, amphibians, this is the atmosphere in which they feed, mate, and move, their own breathing folded into the forest's collective respiration. Water continues its hidden journey as well. In the pre-dawn hours, when temperatures are at their lowest, some trees draw water upward through root pressure, replenishing the reserves lost to the slow leak of the nocturnal transpiration. This upward flow can push tiny droplets, called guttation, to the tips of leaves or the edges of grass blades, glistening like dew in the first light. Such moisture carries dissolved minerals gathered from the soil, which will be used in the day ahead for photosynthesis, growth, and reproduction. Even without sunlight, the internal plumbing of the forest remains in motion, ensuring that when the energy of the morning arrives, every cell is prepared to act. The lunar influence, though invisible to most senses, is still woven into these hours. The gravitational pull of the moon continues to shift water subtly within trunks and branches, a cycle that may help regulate the internal distribution of resources. Some researchers suspect that the timing of certain flowering events or seed releases in tropical forests may align, at least in part, with these lunar cycles, though the mechanisms remain mysterious. If true, it would mean that the moon's pull is not just a distant physical force, but an ancient signal that trees have incorporated into their own biological calendars. Communication in the forest does not sleep. The underground networks linking trees through roots and mycorrhizae remain active, moving chemical messages from one plant to another. A tree experiencing drought, stress, insect damage, or disease may release signals through these pathways during the night, triggering defensive responses in its neighbours before the threat can spread. Above ground, volatile compounds drift on the night air, some attracting pollinators that only emerge after sunset, others deterring herbivores or warning of danger. The darkness may give these signals greater reach, as cooler, more stable air allows them to linger and spread. For the forest as a whole, nighttime respiration is a period of recalibration. Energy budgets are balanced, damaged tissues are mended, nutrients are positioned where they will be needed most when photosynthesis resumes. Young leaves are primed to capture light, and buds are loaded with the resources they will require to unfurl. In the roots, reserves are ready to support a new day's uptake of water and minerals. By the time the first faint glow touches the horizon, the forest is no longer simply waiting, it is poised. The quiet of night is not empty stillness, but the build-up of potential, the preparation for the surge of activity that dawn will bring. As light filters into the canopy, the transformation is immediate. Stomata open wider, carbon dioxide flow reverses, and oxygen begins to pour into the air. The carbon released during the night becomes the raw material for the day's photosynthesis, recycled into sugars that will feed the tree through the next cycle. The forest breathes deeply, shifting from its nocturnal exhalation to its daylight inhalation, the rhythm as old as the first green life on land. And yet the night's work lingers in every cell, in every molecule of energy now ready to be spent. Without the steady hidden labour of those dark hours, the brilliance of the day could not exist. The night's breath of the forest is therefore not the opposite of its daylight breath, but its complement. The two together form a complete cycle, a living pulse that moves with the rotation of the earth, with the turning of seasons, with the quiet pull of the moon. It is a reminder that life is not only what we see in the light, it is also what happens in the unseen hours, in the silent exchanges of gases, in the unseen movements of water, in the chemical conversations carried by roots and air. The forest does not stop when the sun goes down. It simply shifts to another mode, one that is slower, softer, but no less vital. To stand among the trees at night, to breathe the same air they breathe, is to share in this hidden half of life, to feel the calm, enduring rhythm of a living world that never truly sleeps.